Hello and welcome to Student Affairs Live, the weekly web show for student affairs professionals in higher education. This episode of Student Affairs Live is a part of the Higher Ed Live network, offering viewers direct access to the best and brightest minds in education. Live webcasts allow viewers to share knowledge and participate in discussions around the most important issues in student affairs. And you can tune in to Student Affairs Live on Wednesdays. I am your host, Heather Shea Gasser from Michigan State University. And today we're talking about mental health issues among student affairs professionals. If you have a question or would like to comment on today's show, please tweet us using the Higher Ed Live hashtag and also add the SA Commits hashtag today. Thanks so much to Valerie Ruska, who will be monitoring our back channel today again on Twitter. Thanks so much, Val. So before we get on to the show, I'm going to give a shout out to our show's sponsors. As you all know, Higher Ed Live is sponsored by M. Stoner, a marketing and communications firm that works with education institutions on branding, strategy, web design, and more. M. Stoner is offering free 30-minute print consultations in May and June. If you're interested in having your suite of admission or advancement materials reviewed, please connect with us via the link that we're tweeting out right now, and you can sign up. Student Affairs Live is also exclusively sponsored by ACPA, College Student Educators International. ACPA's strategic partnership with Higher Ed Live calls attention to the unique pairing of innovative professional development delivery with the strength of a renowned professional association. Have you renewed your ACPA membership? If you call now to renew and mention Higher Ed Live, ACPA will send you a free copy of Eric Qualman's book, What Happens on Campus Stays on YouTube. So check out the tweet that we're sending out now for details on how to do that. So as more students come to campus presenting mental health concerns, we in Student Affairs have generally worked to increase our awareness. In fact, this month, May, is Mental Health Awareness Month. So as we seek these additional resources to address the needs of students, we shouldn't also ignore those of us in Student Affairs who face the stigma from mental health or illness concerns. So today's show, we're going to be focusing on this topic, and I'd like to welcome my guests, Dwaine Campbell, who's the chair of the ACPA Commission for Counseling and Psychological Services and a psychologist at the University of Michigan. Hi, Dwaine.
Hi.
Kristen, Abell, and Sue Caulfield are the founders of the online series Committed and contributors to the new ebook Committed to Mental Health and Student Affairs. So today's show promises to be an engaging and important conversation. I appreciate you all for being here today. If you'd like to see the complete bios of each of our guests, we're sending out a link now that you can read about each of them. So let's start with a quick intro. Can each of you share your current role on your campuses and then specifically talk about why this topic is important to you or why you wanted to be on Higher Ed Live today? Dwaine, we'll start with you.
Hi, welcome everyone. I'm excited to be here to talk about this. And for me, I think what makes this really important is the fact that we often in our jobs take care of students, and I see many student affairs professionals who bring students over to my office who are struggling, and they know that we're a good resource. They know that when students come here, they feel supported, they get better, they're more successful. And of course, I also want my colleagues to think about, that the same type of resources can also be a resource for them. Not necessarily in our offices. On our campus, we separate out student services versus staff services. But nonetheless, though, I know for a fact that these services work, so I would hope that we're not just talking to students about this, we're also actually using this in our own lives to make our lives better and also to help ourselves be more successful and happy. So for me, the idea of talking about, not just students, but also like, what are we doing for ourselves as we work hard every day to support our students? It's a really important topic. So I'm happy to be here and talk about this with you all.
Thanks so much, Dwaine. Kristen.
Yeah, hi, I'm a web developer at the University of Missouri, Kansas City. And so, of course, that doesn't naturally lead to mental health, but one of the things that is the reason this is important to me is several years ago I started blogging about my depression and my struggles with that. And when I first opened up, I was a little cautious. I was nervous about how that would go, and I wasn't as open about it with colleagues. But then eventually I did share with some colleagues, and the response was overwhelming. I had a number of people contact me and just say, I can't believe there's somebody else out there that feels the way that I feel, that's dealing with this. You know, I thought I was alone. And so that kind of just showed me that there was this need for us to discuss this topic in student affairs, that a number of people were struggling with this and struggling silently. And so bringing that to the forefront has since then been something that I've been very passionate about.
Including giving a Pecha Kucha at ACPA this past year, right? So we're going to tweet out a link to that if you haven't seen it. It's definitely a must-see. So thank you for that, Kristen. Sue.
Hi, everybody. My official title is I'm the Assistant Director of Student Affairs at the Hofstra North Shore LIJ School of Medicine. Some of you may have seen me from my Soodles on social media everywhere now, and I'm a big fan of visual language, and this is kind of a secondary passion of mine. I'm really working in a medical school. I see daily how mental illness affects our students, and I see daily, too, how our staff doesn't talk about it as much as they should. So Committed was kind of the result of that last year, and personally it means a lot to me to talk about mental illness in student affairs, and I'm looking forward to continuing that conversation today.
Definitely. So one of the things that I think brought our attention, obviously, this month is Mental Health Awareness Month in May. And so I appreciate Kristen reaching out and saying this would be a great show topic. But, you know, like many awareness months or days, we seem to highlight the issue during that period, but generally either ignore it or it's on the back burner the rest of the year. So I'd like to start with just how can we be more intentional about infusing conversations about mental health and illness into our daily practice in student affairs? Kristen, do you want to start, and each of us can kind of talk about it?
Yeah, Sue's going to talk about the Committed series a little bit more, but that was originally the intention behind this series, was to get people talking about it and to keep them talking about it beyond May. So that was kind of why we started that. But I think one of the things that's really important is that we're not just talking about it and saying, here, I have mental illness, the end, but to continue talking about it, to say, I'm having to take a mental health day today, to say I had to talk to my family about this today, or I had to talk to my boss, or to even have those little moments where it has impacted our work or our lives, and to be able to share those and be able to share them in a space that people can respond to that and say, okay, how are you doing? Are you doing okay? And to make sure that that space is, if not safe, at least a place where we can get support.
Yeah, I agree. The conversation can't end with just, this is what is going on for me. It's the daily conversation as well.
Absolutely.
Sue, what are your thoughts on how we can kind of infuse this into our daily conversation?
So as Kristen mentioned, this was the original idea for the Committed series. You know, a tweet came up. Hi, Stacy, if you're watching, thanks for the tweet that started it all. And I immediately kind of got in contact with Kristen, and I said, you know, she's right. Like, why aren't we talking about this more? And I think personally, I was at a point too where I wanted to see more of the conversation. So after speaking with Kristen, it kind of became an E-Series was kind of a very natural venue for us to discuss this in, because we are both very active on many social media streams. And I think kind of having the opportunity for staff members from all types of backgrounds and institutions and levels to provide these stories and really display what they were going through was the goal of it. And just putting the information out there has made a real difference, I think, to a lot of people. I think, too, that we wanted to focus on highlighting it in the month that it's about, but we also were hoping that, and it has, which is great, that the Committed series would continue online and offline throughout the year. So now that we've kind of seen that happen, we're working even harder to help continue the conversation.
Great. Dwaine?
So I think part of one of the key essential ways we can begin to make this more part of our conversation is to work to kind of further destigmatize it. My hope is that as we talk about, for example, we're working with colleagues, we're working with they're facing difficulties, we think about things such as, like, if they're they have a medical problem, we probably say, hey, or I know a good doctor over here, or like, you might want to go get some support around that in the sense of like that your back is hurting, or for example, the person's having car issues. We think about, talking about this is like, there's some good mechanics in town. My hope is that we can also make mental health as also part of the conversation. So when a person talks about experiencing stress, anxiety, feeling down, things like that, we say, have you considered, kind of talking, kind of giving some support around that? Doing some problem solving with a counselor to kind of explore what's going on for you and what can be helpful. I think having that be more of the conversation. So for anything in the sense of like the same way as this before a person gets their car fixed, you go to a mechanic. When you have medical problems, you go to a medical doctor. They should also be part of our conversation that it's a resource. We have these people who are trained and they've got many years of experience, so why aren't we using them as resources to make our lives better? I think the other piece is the idea that, how can we recognize in the sense that people have different identities and backgrounds that may influence the way they think about mental health services. So I think recognizing that is also an important piece. So I know that, as an African American person, there is stigma around mental health services, and I think the stigma for African Americans is greater stigma than it is for, I think, white Americans or other ethnic groups. So being aware of that, I think that we can think about that. And so how do we talk about these pieces with our colleagues? And I often think about, like, saying, for example, like, I wouldn't say, hey, go get some therapy, or like, I could say that, but maybe that word is threatening for them. So maybe I might say, maybe meeting with a counselor can be helpful. Problem solve, get some support. So I think about how do we reduce the stigma? How do we work harder to make it so that it can feel okay? This is a good resource and it's helpful.
Yeah. We're definitely going to go into that in greater detail too. I mean, I think the idea behind this is to raise awareness and also demystify it, but then bring it out into the open, and it's not something that you have to do to suffer behind the scenes and not talk about it. So I think that's a really good point, making the conversation a part of our everyday lives. Yeah.
Other thing I want to add, I think one of the pieces that's important is that we need to be thoughtful about how we do talk about it, how we don't talk about mental health, and how we do talk about it. For example, if we're in a meeting with our colleagues and we're talking about a student who's gone to the counseling center, who has used resources, if we talk about that in a negative way, we're sending messages to our colleagues saying that that's something bad, that makes them, that's something that's, it sends some negative message around it. So being mindful of that when we talk about students, knowing that this is making them stronger, this is a great resource. The fact that they've gone, that's a good thing. So we want to be mindful of that when we talk to our colleagues and not put this negative image, negative perception on a person using services. It's a good thing.
Yeah, yeah. You can use services when you're doing well as well. I mean, I think that's the other piece, is that therapy is and counseling be a great kind of constant in our lives. So on last week, actually, SA Chat has really been tackling this topic, not just in context of the book, but also as a SA Chat topic last week. And one of the questions that came up last week was, is there a difference between mental health and mental illness? So Kristen, I know you were a part of last week's SA Chat and had thoughts about this. How are those two similar, alike, different, and when we're talking about them, can we use those words interchangeably?
Right. I think, and this is kind of what I was tweeting about, is that I think we tend to fear using mental illness because there's a lot more stigma associated when we use the word mental illness than when we say mental health. Mental health is broader. It can address a number of things like stress, work-life balance, anything in there. Whereas when we're talking about mental illness, we're talking about being diagnosed. And I think that there's a lot of fear around using that word. And so one of the things that we've been really intentional about in the Committed series is saying we're talking about student affairs colleagues with mental illness, and that's not a bad thing. That's just part of their lives. And so we've really been trying to eradicate that stigma around the term mental illness, and that's really important for us as part of this series.
Anyone else have other thoughts on how we should use them together or similarly or differently?
I think kind of along the lines of what Kristen said, it's really, it's been difficult for me personally to use mental illness over mental health because I guess in talking to staff and students, it's definitely, there is more stigma around illness as opposed to health. But I think that getting comfortable with it personally has kind of allowed me to be a little bit more open about it. And I think everybody has kind of a different timeline for that. And I think the series kind of recognizes that a little bit too. It's just we need to kind of get to that point in order to really dig in and address what the stigma is about and get rid of it, hopefully, one day.
Great. So Dwaine, as you mentioned, I think these two topics are really connected, how we're serving students and how we are taking care of our own mental health and mental illness issues. And we're addressing the topic, you know, specifically from the needs of professionals today, but we don't want to exclude the needs of students as well, who are increasingly coming to campus, and you know, the demand upon our campus resources is increasing. Can you talk a little bit about how meeting the needs of student affairs professionals' mental health is linked to our concerns with serving students?
I think the two are intricately interwoven. When you think about the work we do and our ability to do it well, I don't believe we can do our jobs well without attending to our mental health needs. I think the analogy you talk about on the airplane, you know, for example, the mask pops down, there's, you know, turbulence, whatever, the mask pops down, put your mask on first, then put someone else's mask on next. I think it's so true. I've seen many student affairs professionals over the years, especially younger colleagues, whether it be RAs, things like that, struggle with different difficulties, whether it be anxiety, especially around perfectionism. You know, trying to be the best they can be and be really responsible and do all these programs. And they struggle with that balance piece, and at times, you know, it's led to these students, you know, struggling to maintain their GPAs at times. Some of them struggle to even stay enrolled in school because they struggle to do it all. And I think recognizing the fact that, you know, I'm having conversations like, if you are struggling so much that you are struggling to stay on campus, how are you going to take care of the students that you care so much about? I think for some, they may ignore it, but some of the mental health things may show up as physical concerns. I think that shows up often. So maybe headaches, body aches. So even if a person may not necessarily realize it's mental health related, it can show up and impact them and impact their work. And of course, you know, anxiety often can show up as irritability. A person can have a numbness. For example, maybe a student is dealing with, let's say, some difficulty, maybe sexual assault, maybe family of origin issues, you name it. Your response as a person, when you're supporting, when you work with a student, may be impacted. So maybe more irritable. Maybe you're numb. And if normally, you know, a person hearing this from a student would be maybe sad or worried or anxious, but you're having this numb response. What is that about? And it may be linked to the fact that maybe you have some things that are impacting you. So this is where, as mental health professionals, if we don't attend to our own stuff, it's going to come and impact our work. I think it could be, for example, maybe you have an over-exaggerated response. Maybe someone comes in and talks about some difficulties, and you're feeling really strongly impacted by that. Maybe you're crying. Is that about the person who you're supporting, or is it about something that you had that's going on? I know my own my personal life. I think about our work. My dad passed away last year, and when it came to doing grief work with students, it became very difficult. It brought up a lot of feelings for me, and for me I had to step away from work for a bit and take care of my own needs. And I remember working with supervisors and working with my boss about kind of doing more work in some areas, but not that area. But also, I remember I saw a counselor, and I talked about, my dad being diagnosed with cancer and what it brought up for me, and my feelings around it. And because of that, I was able to come back and do my job sooner and more efficiently. I could not have done my job very well at all if I did not attend to what was going on for me and the feelings of grief losing my dad at the time. So I think it's an integral part of us doing our jobs efficiently and effectively.
Thank you for sharing that story. Yeah, I mean, I really feel like if we attend to the needs that we have personally, I know at one point when I was in graduate school, I thought if I saw a student who was coming into my office and saying some of the things that I'm hearing myself say to myself, like I would take them to the counseling center. And so it's listening to the advice that we talk about with students. But I think your point about it having then a direct effect on how effective you can be in your role, those are really important pieces. So let's talk a little bit about the SA Commits hashtag, which we're using today as well, which, I'd love to hear the history and the background about how that got started, and just in general about the book. So Kristen, do you want to give us a kind of a brief overview, and specifically, tell us how we can access the book as well and whose voices are represented and all of that?
Sure. Well, it all started last year. Sue came to me and said, I have this idea for maybe a comic or something around mental health. I saw this tweet from Stacy about the fact that we don't talk about mental health unless it's like the topic du jour, and how can we keep it in the forefront of people's minds, at least online. And so I said, what if we did a series of blog posts, and what if and the two of us started brainstorming and came up with this idea to have contributors from student affairs, so it wasn't just the two of us sending stuff out, but really all of our colleagues, so that people could see how widespread of an issue this really was. And so we knew based on people who had contacted us personally, we had some people in mind, but then we kind of threw out hey, who's interested in talking about this? And when we did that, the gates just opened up. I mean, we had people knocking on the door, and this year we have almost nobody who is a returner from last year, because we have that many people additionally who are interested in sharing their stories. We have very few returners this year, and I think that's just, it's amazing to me to see how this has grown, but also how we have been able to reach out to people. And so, I think it really has snowballed a lot from there. After we did all of the blog posts and the illustrations that Sue did, we thought it would be great if we had these compiled somewhere. And so we went to Tom Kriegelstein from the Student Affairs Collective and said, Tom, can we do a book? This needs to be a book. And he was more than supportive of that. And we were able to work on that and put that together with the illustrations and really compile it. And of course, it's all people who were willing to be a part of that book, and they're all of our colleagues. And it's everything from depression to bipolar to maybe they don't have a mental illness, but they have a loved one who does. And so it's a broad range of people who are affected by mental illness in many ways. And that book is available on Amazon. I think we're going to tweet out the link to that. And so, yeah, all the proceeds from that go to Mental Health America too, which is something that Sue and I asked when we started the series. We were looking for resources, and they have some really great information about Mental Health Awareness Month, and so that's how we selected them.
Awesome. That's great. Yeah, I know that's often a provider for a lot of our campus resources when they're looking to create awareness campaigns. So that's awesome that the proceeds go there. Sue, what have you seen so far from the series? What have the outcomes that you've experienced, and then what's your hope for the future?
So it's been pretty amazing, to say the least. So a little bit of data. Last year for the series, overall, we hit over 26,000 views on the Student Affairs Collective site for all of the stories combined, which is incredible to me because I mean, when we started, Kristen and I thought, okay, so I'll write one week, you write one another week, and we'll have 2 stories, and that'll be great. But, you know, it's amazing to see how much it's grown. For this year's first week, we had over, it was close to 1,600 views for the week for those 5 stories. So that was really good. And I mean, those are just some numbers that I'm throwing out. Qualitatively, I think if you talk to any of the contributors, that's where you really see the impact, because storytelling in itself is really powerful. It's a powerful tool. We know that from our field. But when you talk about your own story or somebody that you love story regarding, you know, surrounding mental illness, it becomes really cathartic for a lot of people, and it just gives them the opportunity to sit down and really think about the topic and think about what they've gone through or what their experience with somebody else has been, and that in itself is really powerful, I think. We've also gotten, Kristen mentioned this before, we've gotten a lot of people who have come to us and said, hey, I want to share this or do that, or how can I talk to people in my office about this? You know, who can I reach out to? And that's kind of where some of the resources that we've shared have been. We've reached out to Mental Health America. ACPA has been phenomenal with sharing basically everything that we've shared from the series. So it's really grown a lot in a year. And I mean, my hope for the future is that it continues to get bigger and better, and that every time that someone in Student Affairs looks to their left and to their right and gathers in a room with people, they just kind of think about who else might be affected by mental illness.
Yeah, that's great. Yeah, I downloaded the book last week, so I hope others. We just sent out a tweet. Will access it as well. And to all of you who are watching today who contributed to the book, thank you so much for sharing your stories. You know, so Kristen, you know, for people who have shared their stories in a pretty direct way, there's probably even more who don't feel comfortable disclosing mental health concerns. You know, can you talk a little bit about the risks of openly sharing about mental illness, and if you have faced any risk for being directly open about your experiences with depression?
Right, definitely. I've been really fortunate in sharing my story, that I've mostly received a lot of support from people both who suffer from mental illness and those who don't. And I recognize, though, that I'm in a situation of privilege because my colleagues have been supportive, my coworkers here have been supportive, but there are many people that I have not openly talked to about this. Granted, I have video out there that's me talking about it, and I've written about it publicly, but when people come up to me face-to-face want to say something, it catches me off guard, and I stutter a little bit, and I'm like, oh, we're not actually talking about this right now. But I think that the risks that are associated with it is this idea that we're not fit to do student affairs work. We're weak. We may not be able to handle the stress. And, you know, one of the things that I think has affected me is, I haven't gotten a lot of negative comments directed personally to me. It's still just some of those general ideas that are out there, and there's a silence around it as well. And I think, you know, some people who I would consider to be very close colleagues are completely silent about it, and I have not heard from them. And that to me is almost deafening, because it says that, yes, we're aware that you're sharing this information, but we're choosing to not support you. And that's what I hear in those silences, and I'm sure that's what other people hear as well. And I think that's definitely a struggle. But again, I've been very fortunate for the most part, and I recognize that. And that's part of why I share my story, because I have that privilege to share that story. And I think it's important to do that. And I just want to recognize we've got several contributors this time around who are anonymous because they do not feel like they can share their story because of things that have been expressed in their workplaces, because of job search and the way our field overall has expressed that yes, we want our students to seek mental health, but mental health help, but we ourselves should be stronger than that, as if mental illness is a weakness. And so I think that's what I see overall as the risks is, yeah, they're very real. And maybe I am jeopardizing my, job search in the future. And that's something I've come to be comfortable with. But it took me a long time to get there. And there's a lot of people who are never going to get there. And I totally understand that as well.
Yeah, thanks for sharing that. Either of the other of you want to talk about risks or challenges that have arisen as a result of talking about mental health and mental illness concerns that you faced?
I'll talk about a benefit really quick.
Right.
2 really quick ones. So the first one is in the middle of the series last year, I approached my boss and she wrote for the series. And I think that opened up a conversation that we had skirted around for months. And I think that was a really good roundabout way to kind of have that conversation with her eventually. And then this year, my mom wrote for it, which is pretty cool. And I think that, I've had the conversation with her a couple times, but it meant a lot to our family for her to kind of like have a venue to share something that she's finally ready to share. So 2 benefits is that I think the series has not forced people to have a conversation, but definitely opened up a medium for them to have those conversations.
Awesome.
I can add in a bit. I think that I think some of the risks I think mentioned before, that's definitely there. I think we're hoping we're getting to the point that we recognize that it does make us stronger. It does help us. And I think more people need to hear about the experiences. The more we talk about it, I think the more the stigma is dropped down, and more people are going to recognize the fact that this is something that's a good thing. If you're struggling, if you're going through some difficulty, reaching out, using resources is a positive thing. It makes you stronger. It makes you a better professional. It makes you a better student. So I think that us as leaders, by talking about it, I think it can kind of like help people feel more safe. I know that when I first I got my doctorate, 10 years ago, and when I first was entering the profession as a psychologist, we were looking at my mentors, my supervisors, and thinking these people were perfect. They do everything right. And then once I got to know them better, I got the chance to see that, oh, they struggle in these ways. They have difficulties. They have challenges, and that helped me to feel more empowered. Like, oh, I can be human. I can achieve those goals. This is to be a mental health professional, to be a leader in student affairs does not mean you're perfect. It means you take care of yourself. It means you rise to the challenges. You use resources around you, and those things make you stronger. It doesn't mean that you are weak. And I think hearing about it from others has helped me to recognize that this is a good thing. So I want to continue to pass it down. I know my own personal life, even with a family, my hope is that, as I talked about losing my dad, I try to talk to my siblings and others and say, this is what I'm doing to take care of myself. Because people always wonder, like, how are you coping? It's got to be hard. And I said, I'm getting support. And this is the support I'm getting. I encourage you to also take care of yourself and support also. So my hope is that people do hear it and say, hey, it's okay. It makes you, it's a good thing.
Yeah. So we talked about how this kind of parallels the rise in students' usage of counseling centers on campus. And Dwaine, I'm sure this has had an effect on your place of employment at the University of Michigan, right?
Yes.
So what do you think that's attributed to? I'm interested in general about what that rise is, due to all of a sudden. Do you think it has to do with society generally becoming more open and aware? Students having sought support in high school or at a younger age. I don't know. What are some of the things that you would attribute this kind of generally looking at counseling centers and their usage increasing?
I think part of it is definitely linked to the fact that we are seeing as a cohort, as a generation. They've been exposed to mental health resources for a period of time. And I think that's great. I think the stigma's dropping, which is great. And so I think all those things are playing out. I think one of the things that is the other part is that because mental health resources have been effective, because medications are out there and they're effective, because we can, we can treat anxiety, we can treat depression, we can treat, individuals dealing with autism and things like that, and students on the autism spectrum. We are able to, we have all these innovations that are effective, and as a result, there are student populations that normally may have struggled and may not have made it to the higher education environment, but now they are getting in our doors and they're on campus, and that's great. And they're aware of resources, even if a person wasn't necessarily aware of resources before, they're aware of it now. So word is getting out. We're advertising, doing lots of outreach. So whether you use services and medication in high school, and then if you come to college and you're continuing, or you got into college and you know what, you got on campus, it's difficult, you're adjusting, it's challenging, and someone says, hey, why not go to the counseling center? They've great resources that can help you adjust. People come through the doors, and it's a good thing. The stigma is dropping, so I think between those individuals coming from high school who in the past may not have made it here, and also those who are coming in and the stigma's dropped, they are more aware of our services. I think that's a big part of it. And I think, I will say that I think counseling centers, we've made outreach a big part. We know that there are individuals that have come through our doors in the past. We know that in the past, for example, you think traditional people, for example, white Anglo-Saxon, white women, 19 years of age, tend to be the counseling center's main clientele. Men, people of color, other aspects of diversity, they didn't always come in. So we've been working hard with our outreach to go out there and meet these individuals in the community, connect with them, to them, say that, hey, we're people. We don't bite as counselors. And as a result, they feel more comfortable to come in. So I think lots of good things are happening so that students will come to the door and using our services.
That's great. So Sue, talk to me a little bit about how we can create student affairs video. I mean, you've talked about your supervisor being supportive, but across kind of organizationally, structurally, how do we create divisions and departments that are more in tune with the needs of their staff and a culture? We're talking about a culture shift. Sometimes that can be at the individual level, but also it can be at the institutional level. How do we tackle that?
So I think first and foremost is bringing awareness and education to the fact that mental illness is out there and that it affects a lot more people than we think it affects is number one. And I think being particularly aware to our staff members who are on the front lines of things, as we like to call it, where they might be seeing, hearing, or experiencing things that can be triggers for some folks who are already prone to mental illness or are just discovering that they may have mental illness. That's kind of number one. I think kind of recognizing what you can do in your own role, too, is really important. So, for example, if you're a supervisor, kind of keeping your eyes open, not being afraid to broach the topic with your staff members. Maybe you have, during a departmental meeting or an office meeting, maybe you encourage that people share something that's not necessarily an operational topic for the day, but just kind of like something as a current events thing. And May being Mental Health Awareness Month might be a perfect opportunity to say, I was reading about this a little bit, and just kind of creating an environment where your staff members know that you're open to talking about it at all. You never know kind of what that can bring about. And we see this with our students all the time, so why would it not work for staff members? If you're not a supervisor and you're an employee just hanging out, suggesting topics for these meetings, maybe if you're comfortable sharing anything along the lines with other staff members that you're close with, or just using an initiative that's out there. Last year we used Text Talk Act, I think it is, which was an initiative that was out there where you texted a phone number and it just gave you kind of like a list of discussion topics about mental illness. And I kind of hosted it was like a luncheon. I called it like a luncheon discuss or something like that, and got a couple of staff members just talking about it in general. You know, people didn't necessarily share personal information, but just knowing that people are comfortable talking about it in a work environment can really make a big difference. And then last but not least, Dwaine was saying this a little bit before, but involving your human resources office or your wellness center or your counseling center or an EAP program, finding the resources that your campus has, no matter what they may be, or the other staff members that are well-versed in these topics, and bringing them in to talk to your own staff about it and kind of co-programming together. I feel like the more people we have that want to be involved in this and are really pushing this forward, the better we're off.
Dwaine, do you want to also pipe in? We've had a great question from Twitter, and I'll get the name here in a second. Laura something. So I typed on my screen as I talk. Laura Savredra. I apologize if I'm not saying your name correctly. You know, I think that this relates a little bit to this topic of organizational structure, but with the growing demand for counseling services, how can other colleagues support? And I think it has to do with this kind of organizational change and shift. So do you want to add your thoughts?
When you say, so you're thinking about the growing demand for services, how do people support in the sense of getting students over, or maybe encouraging the university to offer more resources? I'm not sure what.
Right. So let's tackle the first one, and then I'll come back to to Laura's question. So the first one, just in general, about organizations and how can we create divisions and departments that create a culture, right? So where people who are dealing with mental illness don't suffer from a stigma associated with that. So why don't you talk about that first, and then we'll go to Laura's question.
So I think that again, I think we, as leaders, making it safe, talking about individuals, talking in the sense of recognizing there's a whole person, not that, you know, their parents, they have lives outside the university, so recognize that, okay, how can I support this person, knowing that when they're taken care of, when they are feeling safe, when they are healthy, when they're healthier and happier, it makes them a more efficient employee, a better employee. I think about them as whole people, and then as a result, support them, and so checking in and figure out, like, what they need, and then helping them connect those resources. So I coordinate as a training program here with my center, and I'll talk more about that in a minute or so, but one of my responsibilities is definitely being mindful, like, what's going on with my trainees? How are they doing? How are they getting their clients met, needs met? What's going on for them in other ways, for example, job, family stuff, and of course, as not the counselor, but I do care enough that I check in, because things that are going on in their personal lives can impact their professional lives. And then when that occurs, it's my responsibility to check in and say, well, what do you need? How can I support you? Do you think it might be helpful to maybe try to get some support with a counselor in the community to get some support around this, or maybe other resources? So I think part of our job is to talk about that, make that a part of the conversation, and make it normal. Just the same way we might encourage them to go to a medical doctor for back pain. I think that as a supervisor is important. I think the other piece is using people first language. We talk about this a lot in mental health and other professions. So when we use our language to talk about this, we'll talk about it in a way that it doesn't, a person's difficulties, concerns, they don't define them. So you think about, for example, saying a person, a student with a visual impairment. You may say that, but you wouldn't say a visually impaired student. So again, you think about the language, again, a person with a physical disability. Again, people first language. So I think our language can send messages about the way we see it. It doesn't define them. So I think some of my thoughts.
Yeah, yeah. I think we've talked on the show in the past about kind of the blurred line between the personal, the professional, and even the political in some ways. You know, I mean, it's about sometimes taking a stand and being really vocal, and so there is a pretty blurry line. I mean, I think your point about language is also really important, and as leaders, we can model, you know, language that is, you know, preferred, I guess, but then also not use words like, you know, that we would consider tied to mental health issues, like, oh, that's such a crazy thing that person did. I mean, that word in and of itself.
Exactly. Yes.
Right. I mean, it sends the message that's somehow a problem. So, okay, so let's go back to the question from Twitter from Laura, which I think is a really good one, and it also brings the concern about how, you know, we as student affairs professionals who aren't counselors by training, right? So, you know, some of us went to counseling programs, some of us went to very theoretical student affairs programs. You know, maybe we had one counseling class, but we're not counselors by training. You know, how can, with the growing demand for counseling services, how can we do a better job of supporting students? And I definitely extend that to our colleagues and staff. And is there some training? And I think this is probably going to get into our resources a little bit, but what campus training should be done to help, you know, all student affairs folks be better equipped to address the needs of their students as well as staff? Kristen, do you want to tackle this first, or Sue, or?
Yeah, it's a big question.
Yeah.
I mean, you know, one of the things that part of the committed, the goal behind it was to just alert people that this is an issue, and I think that's part of it, is that making people aware of it, and then it's something that we need to pay attention to. So I think that's the first step, is really, we're still in an awareness building stage with a lot of our colleagues, at least around the idea that this is an issue for professionals. I think we're maybe at that next stage with our students, where we know it's an issue with our students. Now what do we do about it? I'm not going to speak to that part as much. I'll let maybe Dwaine talk about that, but I do think we're still in an awareness building stage for talking about mental illness and student affairs professionals.
I think that there's a couple of tools on the ebook, the committed ebook, has a resource section, and I believe one of those tools is a mental health first aid training course. But what I like so much about that is that it's, first of all, I work in a medical school, so first aid is one of the first things the students learn here. But then they also learn that they're not yet doctors and they need to refer. So I kind of feel like that's at least in my own role, that's a lot of what I do. I mean, you can take it to a certain point, but then when a student identifies something, you need to refer. And I think that's too how we kind of need to talk about it with staff members as well. What's so great about the Committed series is that it's created a community to kind of talk about these things. So by no means are we experts. I might be an expert in having panic attacks, and that's about it. But I think that along the same lines, it's kind of, we're building this community to really bring awareness to it, and not necessarily, you know, formally counsel or anything like that. I would hope that eventually one day it could develop into something more, but we're not quite there yet.
Yeah, I think the referral piece is really important, and getting those folks to experts like Dwaine and to the counselors that are on our campuses, or to those who are in our community. And you know, we've talked a little bit about HR, but many campuses have employee assistance programs, and you know, you look into your health insurance policies to see what support they provide for counseling, or you know, to be able to augment the rest of your health maintain, right? So it's should be a part of your health insurance package. So, Dwaine, you talked a minute about your psychology practicum training program. Do you want to give us a little bit of overview of what that is, and then how has the shifting, needs of students and staff kind of changed your program's design and priorities? I assume this is a program that's preparing kind of the next generation of folks who will work in campus-based counseling centers. So talk with me a little bit about that program.
So at the University of Michigan Counseling and Psychological Services, where I work, we actually have 8 training programs here. We actually train psychologists, social workers, and psychiatrists. So I'm over one of the psychology training programs. And it's interesting. I think that the demand, increased demand for services has impacts the training, but I think more in the sense that we are being mindful of our trainees' needs. You think in the sense of that these are up-and-coming student affairs professionals, so we're working with them to think about how are you taking care of yourself. So obviously, the center, we're working hard to meet the increased demand for services. We're being innovative. We're working efficiently. We're working smarter. Working harder. We're doing lots of things. And our directors, they're all trying to figure out, how do we do with this increased demand for services. And this line of thinking also is reflected in our training program. So again, how do we continue to support our trainees and given the system as it changes? So obviously, our trainees get supervision, and that's a good part of them kind of like how do you become an ethical, competent professional where you can take care of your clients, and as a part of that, taking care of your clients is taking care of yourself. So APA principles guide this, a lot of guidelines, and so our trainees' development and growth is only secondary to our client care. And obviously our trainees, they're not here to as free labor. They're not here as free labor. They are here to be trained and grow. So as we are adjusting to the increased load, we're looking at our system as a whole, is adjusting it, but when they see clients in our system, our trainees, they see clients that are appropriate, and also they get appropriate supervision to take care of their clients and also take care of themselves. And of course, because the two are interwoven, that means better care for our students. So I think that we manage it. We are very smart about it. We have lots of options. I think counseling students across the country are probably using different things like the group options. We have drop-in workshops. Lots of different things we're doing to get our students connected to the resources they need in a very efficient way. So I don't know if it's an easy answer for that, but we make sure that I think our trainees, though, in doing the job, that they're cared for and they're taught to be competent professionals.
Yeah, great. So we had a really good question from Twitter that I think kind of follows up on what we were talking about regarding students and how we can help them get access to resources. So Maggie Roke asked, when does care cross over into counseling, and how do we support students in seeking qualified help without becoming that support person for them? And I think this is a really great question. We as student affairs folks, we value that relationship with students, but sometimes, we need to help them find another person who can really be there on an ongoing basis. Sue, do you want to respond to this or see what your thoughts are on that?
Sure. So I work in a smaller institution now, well, in a smaller school that's part of a larger institution now. So I wear a lot of hats, and sometimes the counselor hat shows up even though you don't want it to a little bit, and you have to kind of be aware that you're wearing it and pass it along to the person who actually needs to wear it pretty quickly. So how I handle it personally in my role is that when it gets to a point where I feel like the student has either admitted that they have a diagnosis or struggling with something that kind of warning signs go off where it's over my head or out of my purview a little bit. I work in a medical school, so how I explain it to them is, would you want the same EMT that's taking care of you in the ambulance to walk you and go through surgery with you? Probably not. So and that's kind of how I start the conversation with them. Sometimes it gets a little bit of a laugh, which is good at the moment as well. And then we talk about, what resources are out there. We actually have kind of dual resources for our students. So there's something called a physician resource network that addresses specifically their needs as future physicians, and then we also have a whole counseling center here at Hofstra. So, I mean, we're lucky in the fact that we have both resources, and I always ask the student, too, if they're seeing somebody outside of either one of those entities that they've seen in their past, maybe at home or something like that, and that kind of triggers you in their mind, too, okay, maybe it's time that I set up another appointment or I follow up with that doctor, too. So that's kind of how I handle it personally.
That's great. And I mean, in my past role working in a women's center, we would often form really close relationships with students and then really need them to access. And so a lot of times it had to do with just being purposeful and then walking them there. But I liked your point about the medical, the medical. He wouldn't want me to, this is something that I'm not trained to do. So, yeah. Let's move on back to student affairs practitioners and those of us who are, experiencing mental illness. I think we've talked a lot about, and I think I've seen some recent blog posts about openness and authenticity, and are there risks to that? I think some folks have experienced some discrimination. Kristen, what kind of resources would you tell folks if they have experienced discrimination based on a mental health concern or mental illness concern?
Well, the nice thing about working in student affairs is that we have a lot of great resources on our campus. But one of the first ones I'd tell them to approach is HR. HR is going to know more about the discrimination policies on your campus and what is allowed and isn't allowed, and also what benefits you might have or what employee assistance programs you might have to help you. So I would definitely start with HR. Another office on campus that might be really helpful is your disability services office. Again, they may have some information about ADA and other sorts of resources. And then, of course, your counseling center is another great resource. But definitely, for me, I would go to HR first, just because that's the resources they provide are going to be tailored for employees.
Yeah, great point. So let's go on to talking about resources. So if someone who's watching the show today says, wow, I recognize some of the things that we're all talking about within myself, what actions can they take right now? But then also, what resources have you all looked to that you'd like to share? I always like to leave the show with some kind of whether it's articles, books, websites, TED Talks, places where people can go. And I see that Val is really busy tweeting out a whole bunch of things that Sue and Kristen had compiled in advance. So why don't we start? Sue, do you want to give us your kind of top 5 resources?
Sure. So I mentioned before. So the Committed series, I think Val just tweeted actually, this year we're kind of promoting the theme of what mental illness looks like, and of course stomping out stigma, which has been Kristen's tagline forever, I think, but has kind of become the series' official tagline too. So we're kind of promoting a little bit more community with encouraging folks to print out a free PDF that happens to be a Soodle, so we'll do that, and then share with the community, just so we can kind of, if you don't want to write a blog post or share anything else, you can at least share your thoughts that way. There are 2 hotlines, actually, that I want to bring to everybody's attention. The first one is the National Suicide Prevention Hotline, and I think we're going to tweet the link out for that as well. And then also the Trans Lifeline, which is, I think, a newer resources that have come about, and they're both 24/7 free hotlines that can be used by anybody, so it's a good resource for students and staff members, of course. The other one I wanted to talk about is the Committed series has a Pinterest board, and shout out to Carly, who has been the mastermind behind the Pinterest board, as well as a lot of our other visual editing this year on the Committed series. And the Pinterest board, you think Pinterest and you think, good recipes and wedding planning if you're me, but it has a lot of really, really good resources on it too that Carly has pinned, and she's kind of separated them into different categories as well, so definitely check that out. And then last but not least, a really great book that I've read by Ellen Sachs, who's a faculty member, and it's about her journey through madness, as she likes to call it. It's called The Center Cannot Hold. It's an autobiography, and it's very honest, and I really, really loved reading it. So anybody out there who just is looking for a good read on mental illness, that's definitely one of them.
Great. Put that on my list. Kristen.
Sorry, took me a second. Well, I did mention Mental Health America. They've got a really great toolkit for Mental Health Awareness Month, and it's got all sorts of infographics in it. Some of the tweets and statistics that we've been sharing this month are from that toolkit, and they have some really great programs going on, and so that's a great resource. If you're looking at mental health information for students, the JED Foundation is another good resource. They are specifically, or they tend to look more specifically at suicide and the impacts of that. If you're really wanting to know, and this is a little bit of a shameless plug, but what it looks like to have mental illness or to struggle with that, I talk about that a lot in my Pecha Kucha that I did. And so if you're wanting to know what it's like for somebody who suffers from depression, I think that's a pretty good example of that. Also, the Committed ebook, of course, which we've mentioned, and then the National Alliance on Mental Illness is another great resource.
Great, thank you. Yeah, I told you all before we started the show that I watched the Pecha Kuchas, both of you are Pecha Kuchas, earlier this week, and if you haven't yet checked out the whole gamut, but specifically Kristen and Sue's, I highly recommend it. Dwaine, resources that you would like to share, that you would like to leave the show kind of with?
I can definitely touch on those. Should I also touch on some, if they're listening, things like next steps they might want to consider?
That'd be great. That'd be great.
So I think for resources, I think employee assistance programs are great places to start if you're university employees. And I think we touched on them a little earlier, but I think they can definitely help in the sense of like, a lot of them will offer some free services for university employees. So if you're a student affairs employee with not a lot of money, you can actually get some good services starting point, good services through them. You can also, if maybe they're not the best fit for you, maybe they can help you connect with other resources in the area, whether it be at community mental health, things like that, lower costs. I know sometimes a copay can be a lot for individuals. So if a copay is too much for you, I think the employee assistance programs can be useful. If copays can be fine, check with your insurance companies, but also, again, working with the employee assistance program to help you find resources. Psychology Today is another resource. Psychology Today is a good resource in the sense of you can look at, and check for providers that matches your insurance. One thing I will say as you are looking for resources, be aware that there are lots of interventions out there that can be helpful for a person. I think sometimes we aren't aware that, medical resource interventions, therapeutic interventions, different techniques, relaxation techniques. Be open to that. I think it's important to be open to all the different interventions. When exploring counseling options, for example, knowing that fit matters, so recognizing that, hey, you may not always click with every single person, just like you don't click with every doctor. So if you don't like the counselor that you're talking with, move on, find someone else. It's okay to do that. It makes a big difference in the outcome, so we want you to kind of find someone you're comfortable with. When it comes to, even if you're seeing a doctor or a medical doctor or a counselor for services, wellness matters. So things like your sleep and exercise, all those things can make a difference also. So being mindful that it's not just the typical like therapy, but also things outside of therapy. So wellness plays a difference. And the last thing I want to say is that if you decide that counseling is for you, recognize that change doesn't happen overnight. There are great things that will be effective. We've got research to support the effectiveness of these things. But be patient in the sense that talk with your doctors, talk with your, most people see progress in a couple of sessions, but change takes time. Medications typically take 4 to 6 weeks, depending on medication. So knowing that if you're using medication, if you're doing counseling, you'll see some progress, but you won't see dramatic change overnight, and that's normal. But people do see progress. They do see progress when using services. So key point is not to give up. Don't give up. We know it's effective out there. Talk to the doctors. Ongoing communication is really important. So, if something's not working for you, if the intervention doesn't fit for you, talk to the person you work with and say, hey, you know what? I'm not sure how I feel about this. That ongoing communication is key, and that leads to a better outcome also. So I think I'll stop there. Becomes my thoughts.
Great, thanks so much. We're going to put out links to as many of these resources as we can. Again, to all three of you, I really appreciate your time today. Thank you for sharing your stories. Thank you for sharing your experiences, as well as all of the great resources. So your contributions are definitely noted. And to everybody who is watching and tweeting along on the back channel today, and to Val, thanks for that as well, because I think it was a pretty rich dialogue. So next week on Student Affairs Live, 1:00 p.m. next Wednesday, my incredible co-host Tony Duty will be back, and he will be talking with Dr. Patty Perillo and John Hoffman from ACPA and NASPA, respectively, about the update to the professional competencies for student affairs. Those of you who know and use this document well, the update is big news in student affairs. Many of us have based professional development programs around it. Our conferences and conventions have been tied to these professional competencies, so this should be a really important show for everybody to watch. And again, you can receive reminders about this and all of the other shows on Higher Ed Live by subscribing to the newsletter. Our archives are also available, and we also broadcast via iTunes podcast, so lots of different ways to access Higher Ed Live content. Again, my name is Heather Shea Gasser. Thank you so much to everyone who's watching, and thanks again to my panelists today. I hope you all have a great week.